This is Canon Fodder, episode 44. My guest this week is a good friend of mine from the Twitter sphere. He's a poster. He's in pretty much every group chat that I'm in. Mr. Ham. Ham, how are we doing?
Hey, man, how's it going?
So you and I actually met through the Prudentialist, if I'm not mistaken. And let me tell you, I think that you have one of the most highly curated timelines in terms of good takes and content. And I highly recommend people follow you if they're not already.
Oh, thank you, thank you. Yeah, hey y'all, it's Ham.
And I'll definitely link your at in the show notes.
Well, thank you, sir.
When I reached out, I asked if you'd read, or I asked what book you wanted to read, and I was really happy to hear that you wanted to talk Slaughterhouse V. What is your relationship to the book? When did you first read it, and what do you like so much about it?
Well, I think the first time I read it was probably close to middle school, so I didn't really appreciate it. I probably put too much weight on the way that he uses humor, and I wasn't able to contextualize why he used it and the narrative as a whole. But I think that's the first time that I read it was probably like middle school, maybe in high school.
Mm,
And then like when I returned to it, after I read Breakfast of Champions, which I love, and then I'd read Player Piano and Sirens of Titan, and then I went back to this because there's just so much in this book, and it's also kind of like an anthology of a lot of his recurrent characters.
right, right. And I've read Breakfast of Champions. I haven't read Player Piano yet, but I have read Sirens of Titan, and this is definitely his best work. I think he's always had really good ideas when it comes to the science fiction aspects of his work. This one really brings together all of his sort of wacky out there ideas with real literary prose and real chops. Because I've read a fair amount of like Philip K. Dick, right, or Robert Heinlein. Actually, the episode before this, I was talking to Paz from Timeline Earth about Heinlein, and the one thing that separates, I'd say, Vonnegut from those other guys is the strength of his characters. He understood people much more than your average science fiction writer who is kind of a spurg, you know.
So, would you classify Vonnegut as a science fiction writer?
Yeah, but yes, I would. I think that I would understand why people don't. I understand why he is in the literature section of like a bookstore rather than the science fiction fantasy section. But I could even consider David Foster Wallace a science fiction writer. You know,
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, just the subjects are there
I
just
think that
because
he
they
would
use it.
be.
Sorry, go
Okay.
ahead.
No, I mean, I think that he would be closer to David Foster Wallace than he would be the giants of science fiction like Dick and Heinlein. There was a review of Slaughterhouse Five. I think it was the New Republic in 1969 that Michael Crichton wrote,
Mm,
and he said calling Vonnegut science fiction because he uses science fiction elements in his writing is like calling a cat a penguin because it's wearing flippers. Um, I just think that I think that Vonnegut just in general is like a man unstuck in time, right?
yes,
Like
definitely.
I think that he, like his pedigree as a writer is not the same as like all those giants like Asimov, Clarke, Dick, Heinlein. It's he got his start with the first thing he had published was in Collier's, which
Mm,
Collier's was it was more of a literary magazine. It ran investigative news articles, and so it wasn't a strictly fiction thing. These titans of science fiction, they generally came up through pulp, and I think there's a couple differences because of that. Like for one, if you write in a science fiction pulp magazine, like the readers are buying it because they want science fiction, that's what they expect. if someone is reading, the Saturday Evening Post or Collier's, like they're really going for potpourri, and the science fiction elements are something that they stumble on. It's not something that they are explicitly looking for when they buy the issue.
And I think Vonnegut's probably in a category all his own, because I think you're looking for both with him. I think you're looking for the cool sci-fi elements and ideas, while also focus sort of character driven stories, right? Because that's probably the difference between literary fiction, let's say, and more genre fiction. Is genre fiction, the genre itself is the main character, right? Whether it's
Mhm.
like an Agatha Christie mystery, or Michael Moorcock sort of western, or James Elroy kind of L.A. noir type deal. Even what's his name? Not Dashiell Hammett, the other guy who wrote the Marlowe stories.
Oh my gosh, yeah, the father of noir fiction.
Yes,
I have like had a huge brain fart. Like, he's one of my favorite writers.
Raymond
Raymond
Chandler.
Chandler, yeah.
Yes, Raymond Chandler was a literary writer as well, but he still stuck within the bounds of noir, right? But
Yeah, yeah.
he would be a more literary noir writer, right? Uh, all these guys, they stay within, like, it, Cormac McCarthy, right, is not a Western writer,
No, no.
but a lot of his stories take place either in the Deep South or in the American Southwest. Dealing with horse thievery and or killing Indians, and I mean, just everything in between. Hell, his first Outer Dark was about an incest baby. He
Yeah,
he
he wrote where he lived. His
Mhm.
first thing he ever had published was in the University of Tennessee's Phoenix Literary Art magazine, which is a great magazine to have a first thing written published in. But he moved out west. So if you read Child of God, it takes
Mhm.
place underneath the Appalachian Mountains, like in the cave system underneath. And if you look at his later stuff, yeah, it's definitely the American Southwest. I think that Vonnegut, like, I don't
He
know
never
if
lived
his
in upstate New York, so I don't understand why most of his stories take place in Ilium.
I like the name.
Oh, it's a great I would live in Ilium, New York, definitely.
Yeah, he was from Indiana, wasn't he?
Yep, Indianapolis, Indiana, and
So
then he moved to New
yeah,
York City.
I don't know why I really like the name Ilium, and he obviously liked it as a setting because he kept going back to it. But as far as, yeah, I think he's more of a literary writer than a science fiction writer, but he could also write the hell. I mean, like, he could conceptualize like an amazing science fiction idea. Like in Cat's Cradle, the idea of Ice Nine,
Mhm.
like that's where the science fiction stuff like surpasses the writing, in my opinion.
I
I
mean,
mean, like,
we wouldn't have Watchmen without Sirens of Titan, which
yeah,
I think is a better work, personally, but there's a lot of science fiction in there, and just there. I'm gonna get so much hate for this, but he also kind of invented, like, the cinematic universe a little bit.
yeah, yeah, he really did, because you've got good old Kilgore Trout, you
The
got Campbell, you got
the Trafalmadorians, you got Mr. Rosewater. Y y d I think even Montana Wildhack, she appears in a different story as well.
yeah, and but in the Sirens of Titan, aren't the Tralfamadorians like different?
Yes,
Aren't they
yes,
like
they're
like
a little
robots?
different.
Yeah. So in Slaughterhouse V, they're like bowling pins with hands on top and eyes in the middle of the hands. But the name was in Sirens of Titan first.
Yeah, that's alright. The in Star Trek, the Klingons change, like, 3 different times.
Oh yeah, yeah, because like in old Star Trek, they were just like really tan humans. They
Yeah.
look like Cubans. and then they've got like these giant plates on their forehead. But yeah, yeah. But I also think that like I don't think the science fiction community accepted Vonnegut as much. He was up for two Hugo or Nebula awards, and that was for Sirens of Titan and Cat's Cradle. And he was a finalist, but he didn't get it. I don't know who beat him when he did Sirens of Titan, but I know that Starship Troopers beat him out
Mhm.
for Cat's Cradle. And I think you can sense like the distance between he and the science fiction community with the character of Kilgore Trout, who I think is a play on your average science fiction writer.
Well, he thought it
Right.
was himself. He thought he believed himself to be Kilgore Trout, that because he wasn't immediately popular,
Yeah, yeah.
and he
But
had all these weird science fiction ideas that nobody really knew what to do with. I have a collection of his short stories, and they're all brilliant in their own sort of way. Some of them I can kind of do without, but there's his very first ones are slice of life sort of Midwestern schlock.
yeah, that
And
was yeah when he was sending out the short stories to the periodicals,
right.
right? Yeah.
And but
I
so he didn't gain his bona fides through Analog Magazine or Clark's World or something. And they I think Clark's World is later, but all like think of the way that like Heinlein or L. Ron Hubbard wrote, right, and got their starts with the pulp magazines or the sci-fi rags. They they didn't he didn't do that so much.
Yeah, and the pulp game, I think it was quantity over quality, right?
Mhm.
L. Ron Hubbard and Asimov really didn't take a lot of time to fine tune the prose, right? They just spit
No.
it out and moved on to the next thing. And even Heinlein, he's like, yeah, go over it, and after you're done with like your third draft, whatever, that's it. Like but he's just unbelievably talented. I think that's why he's a head above Asimov and certainly L. Ron Hubbard.
Yeah, I think that my science fiction hero, as much as I love Vonnegut for every reason under the sun, I think my hero is Heinlein because I certainly edit like he does.
He's my favorite. Like he's so versatile. Like I mean, he's got some duds like what that comedy he wrote, The Rolling Stones, I didn't like. But when the way that he can do voice, when you take something that is got as much personality and warmth as Moon is a Harsh Mistress, and then you turn around and you have like this kind of stoic, duty bound voice in Starship Troopers, like the same guy came up with both of them, with minimal editing because he didn't consider himself a huge stylist, I don't think.
No, definitely not. Whereas I think anyway, I could talk a lot about Heinlein, but we're here to talk about
About
Uncle Kurt.
Vonnegut.
He is my favorite writer ever. This is one of my favorite books, and I'm so happy to have you on to discuss it. It'd be kind of it'd be kind of pointless to go over the plot because it's constantly occurring and reoccurring, and also the timeline doesn't make sense. But one of the brilliant things he does is that it it doesn't make sense to explain, but as you read it, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, it's non-linear. He becomes, it's almost like a series of vignettes
Mm,
where he's at different times in his life. Uh, but the theme, I guess, would definitely be the bombing of Dresden. But yeah, you'd really have to read it. You can't go scene by scene because he skips them, and the chronology is chopped up, which I think is a very 1968 type of thing.
it starts with Vonnegut himself setting out to write the book.
Right.
He is a veteran of World War II. He was in Slaughterhouse V. He survived the bombing of Dresden because he was a POW. brought into the German heartland during the war after the Battle of the Bulge, and he experiences the bombing of Dresden firsthand, and the years that go by, and he wants to try and write about it. I really enjoy his call to his friend,
O'Hare.
and yes, his friend O'Hare, and his conversation with O'Hare's wife, who, she's disgusted by the idea of him writing a war novel and writing something like did you ever see the John Wayne film The Sands of Iwo Jima?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, a really good John Wayne film, not historically accurate at all, but like very very jingoistic sort of machismo type. This is what the woman thinks he's going to write, so he reassures her by saying that he will call it the Children's Crusade.
Yeah,
And
because she when he met with O'Hare, because O'Hare was he's a lawyer. I think he's from Pennsylvania, but he was actually captive with Vonnegut. And Vonnegut, and obviously Slaughterhouse Five was his life's work in the sense that he had been trying to write the novel ever since the war. After he published the novel, he gave an interview on BBC, and he said, "Well, I guess if I'm going to have to reinvent myself if I want to continue to be a writer. Like this one work, I think, was the focal point of his entire career." And so he called up O'Hare because he'd like to drink and smoke cigarettes late at night, and he called up O'Hare to talk about Dresden, and then they arranged a meeting at O'Hare's house. And Vonnegut could just sense that the wife was not very pleased to see him. Like, she had a very icy reception. Literally, he would talk to O'Hare in the kitchen, and she would leave the room, and then she would come in and fix herself a drink, and he could hear her loudly cracking the ice in the ice tray, and then she would leave. And that's finally when he asked her what's wrong, and she said, I think you're going to glorify war. You need to call it the Children's Crusade, which he
well,
actually did.
well, I think no, isn't he doesn't he suggest that he will call it the Children's Crusade, and that I could be misremembering that part. I I do like and I guess it doesn't really matter one way or the other. But I do really like the imagery he uses when he's on the phone, that his breath smells like mustard gas and roses.
Yes.
Just such a very strange combination of things. He even he himself, because he inserts himself in the narrative several times in the book. One in one in the actual slaughterhouse POW camp that he's in. He takes a break from telling Billy's story and says, "Oh yeah, I'm here too." And then also later on in the novel, later on or earlier, it's hard to tell with the timeline, but he himself calls Billy Pilgrim on the phone, and
Okay.
Billy describes he gets the faint whiff of mustard gas
Mustard
and
gas.
roses.
Oh, and I
Uh,
looked it up. You're right. He is the one that suggested calling it the Children's Crusade, and the reason he was prompted to do so was, he said, then she turned to me. She let me see how angry she was, and that anger was for me. She had been talking to herself, so what she said was a fragment of a much larger conversation. You were just babies then, she said. So that's why he offered to name it the Children's Crusade,
right.
because yeah, she said you were just babies then.
And you know that's such an important aspect, I think, to the book, is that he's not glorifying these actions. But it's very reminiscent of Remark and All Quiet on the Western Front, where he's not passing judgment. He is simply stating the facts as he knew them, and to he's not out to glorify anything either, because he fundamentally disagrees with war. One of the things that I love about Kurt Vonnegut is the man he stood for probably everything that I kind of stand against in terms of his politics, but his anti-war streak, he earned that.
Yeah.
The man, Billy Pilgrim, the main character of the book, he is a chaplain, and I apologize, dear listener, that we're kind of all over the place, but this is kind of an all over the place book. Billy Pilgrim is a chaplain's assistant in the war. He's kind of a coward. He's not very motivated to do much of anything. He doesn't have any sort of uh, almost no masculinity, really. And Kurt Vonnegut, he was a pathfinder, so he was the first guy out of the airplanes. He was basically a paratrooper, first guy out of the airplane and helping the other guys land. Kurt Vonnegut was a genuine badass when
Yeah,
he
he
was
was a
a soldier.
scout.
Oh, sorry, no, not a pathfinder. Yes, he was a scout. Sorry. So, but yes, so he was, um, you know, the thing that guys like me who were rear echelon types, we write about Billy Badass, right? And even though we don't have so much experience with that, Vonnegut kind of turns that on his head, turns that on its head rather, and says, "Oh yes, I'm going to present myself as sort of," because Billy Pilgrim is, of course, and just a stand-in for Vonnegut's feelings about things, and he presents himself, the quote unquote war hero, as anything but that, because he does not believe in such a thing as a war hero. Sorry, Ham, you muted yourself there.
Oh, hey, sorry about that.
No, no worries.
Um, I think that you could categorize Billy Pilgrim as like a holy fool, like
Mm,
Prince Michigan in The Idiot, like
mm,
this loving, caring, person that is not very wise to the ways of the world that he's in.
that's interesting. I
Because
wonder. I wouldn't call him a fool though, because he sees the strings of, like, because he exists in and out of time. He's very aloof to existence itself, because he's just constantly replaying the same things over and over again. So I wouldn't
I
say
think Well, no,
sorry.
I think it would be like full in like the Herman Melville, the confidence man situation where you're either a knave or you're a fool.
Mm,
You're either like so worldly wise that you're bitter to the world around you and you accept all of the acrimony and all the danger and you harden yourself to it, or you keep a light soul, but by doing so you behave very foolishly in the context of your situation.
mm.
Because I mean, like, it's foolish to be in war and not be warlike. I mean, it's just an absolute miracle that Pilgrim actually, was captured alive and didn't die a long time before. So,
But it's funny too, because he puts the character of Roland in the book. Roland
yeah,
Peary, who is I mean, he's certifiably insane. He loves war. He hates the Germans. He he has this collection of knives and basically medieval torture devices that he wants to use on uh, wants to use on the Germans to satisfy his duty, as well as his sort of sadistic streak. There are these two scouts that pick up Roland and Billy, and they're trying to get back to the lines. Roland is super annoying, and he thinks that the three of them are the best pals in the whole world. They're the three musketeers. I think he uses the term, and they just they almost just want to ditch both of them, because Billy's, he's lagging about, basically like wanting them to leave him to die, and Roland is like begrudgingly trying to save his life, even though he also hates Billy at the same time. And then unfortunately, the two scouts get killed, and the other two get captured. And Roland develops trench foot because his boots are taken by the Germans, and he has to wear these wooden clogs that that give him
Yeah.
a pretty bad case of gangrene. And that this sounds horrible, folks. It's a very funny book.
It's hilarious.
It's I mean, it's a black humor sort of book, very fatalistic, but at the same time, just the way that Vonnegut is, he can't help but see the absurdity of everything going on around him, and he has to comment the way that he has to.
And the one thing that gets me about it is he's deceptively complex. He is not overtly complex with his writing. He doesn't use like convoluted sentences. It's like it seems like he's stating something simply, but there's so many layers and depth to it. Like Billy and Roland are in some ways they're very much foils to each other
Mhm.
because Billy is not about combat. He wants to play his, he played his organ. He was a chaplain's assistant. He's running around Germany unarmed. Roland is running around with like a World War I trench knife with brass knuckles on it. And Billy is generally kind and doesn't wish ill on anyone. Roland is a bully, and he is cruel to everyone. But you learn that's because he was bullied himself. But
Mhm.
what's really interesting about the two characters is effectively they're the same in the sense that neither one of them killed anyone during the action of the book.
Mm.
Roland Weary attempted to. He was a anti-tank gunner, and he fired at the tank, but unfortunately, he didn't take anybody out, and they captured him.
Right.
So, like the difference between Billy and Roland, aside from the outside superficial stuff, is their intent. Like Roland Weary is a very cruel person who wants to inflict pain on somebody, and Billy Pilgrim really doesn't.
And it's interesting too because if you believe the Weary sort of line of events, it's Billy who has killed Roland Weary, right?
Oh yeah,
Paul Lazaro, who is another soldier captured with them, he believes Roland and promises to kill Billy as revenge for Roland's death, because revenge is the sweetest thing in life. Uh, one part of the POW stuff that I really enjoyed was the description of the British, and how there's a troop of British soldiers who are captured early in the war. They're officers. They're proper lads. They're think the soldiers in Bridge Over the River Kwai, right? They're very meticulous. They keep up their exercise. They have gardens. They're constantly exercising. I think I already said that. And they're keeping their regimen, right, in order to keep their sanity. And the Germans love them, right? The Germans think that they're fellow soldiers, fellow men at arms, and then these American draftees show up, and they're basically animals. The British try to have a welcome feast for them, and these guys are the meeting of conscripts versus professional soldiers is just a really interesting meeting of the minds that Vonnegut plays with, especially because I mean the man this is an anti-war book, and he's still able to make that distinction. Nobody else, I think, would.
yeah. He
Sure.
commented on the difference between because as a prisoner of war, he got to see Turkish prisoners, British prisoners, like imprisoned allies. And he said that it was a uniquely American thing that they just could not handle defeat. Like the Turkish prisoners of war, when they got out of Dresden, he said they looked healthier than they were when they went in. The British, of course, they maintained their spirit, but he said something about being an American, when an American faces loss or capture, that they just cease to function. That there was huge problems with the American soldiers getting all kinds of strange disease because they stopped caring about hygiene and stopped caring about taking care of themselves personally.
There's also the Russian prisoners who aren't being fed at all. They're treated like dogs, and they kind of act with they act like zombies almost.
Yeah, with radium, with faces that glow like the dial of a radium watch.
Which talk about some anachronisms. No, who has a radium watch these days? That's amazing.
Turns out not good for your health, radium.
No, definitely not. Let's see. So he leaves the army alive. Paul Lazaro won't get his revenge until much later. I brought up the British guys before because Paul also declares that he will get revenge on this random British officer who punches Lazaro for going through his stuff.
So yeah, did he steal cigarettes?
Yeah, it was something stupid, right?
Yeah, Lazaro was guilty of, but yeah, he deserved what happened to him, but he vowed vengeance on him.
Yep. And I've always thought about, like, imagine this guy gets home from the war. He lives in like an upper class flat or like some country estate. He hears a knock at the door, and then bang, somebody just shoots him in the chest as he opens the door.
Yeah.
I don't know why that stuck with me for so long, but I guess because and we'll do spoilers. Listeners, at this point, you know that spoilers are always on the table. Billy is killed at the end of the book by a man paid by Paul Lazaro with some sort of futuristic ray gun, which is just a really like an odd thing to put at the end of the book, especially because like right before nuclear war is about to occur.
It's
Vonnegut's an odd duck. He's at a baseball game for the Chicago Cubs, giving a speech about Trafalgar, and some guy in the stand, he predicts his own death is about to occur. A guy shoots at him, and so it goes.
Yeah, and Billy Pilgrim, he proclaimed that he knew when he was going to die. And another thing, after the war, he becomes an optometrist because basically he marries a woman whose father runs an optometry school. But he also becomes an excellent public speaker. He's not really a social butterfly. He doesn't seem to maintain like a lot of close friendships, but he takes a course in public speaking, and because of that, he becomes such a great public speaker. He becomes, the president of the local Lions Club, and he speaks at optometry associations, and he just becomes this great orator because he attended this class.
I want to talk about Billy's wife, Valencia, for a moment. She's a big old gal.
Always eating candy.
Yes, and I thought I was just thinking about this. Roland Weary thinks that he and the two scouts are the Three
The Three
Musketeers,
Musketeers.
and then the first thing that she's seen eating is a Three Musketeers bar. I don't know how much that adds to anything, but it's just such a neat little thing to read. It's not like he hasn't added some sort of profound commentary on soldiers and candy, but it's just a nice little touch that I appreciated when I read it. She's a big old gal. She knows that she is not looks maxed to Billy. She's actually quite surprised that he's going to marry her, and she is totally in love and devoted to him to a fault. Actually, it will lead to her untimely demise later. And she has all these promises to him. She's going to lose the weight. She's going to be beautiful for him. She loves him very much, and he's sort of, again, he's just sort of aloof to all this.
Well, he gets her very fine jewelry. He smuggles a diamond back from Dresden that he gives to her for an engagement ring, and he always buys her like really, really nice, expensive jewelry.
Yeah. See, I mean, yeah. Again, he tries to be a good husband. Uh, Later on, he's taken up into a flying saucer, and he's brought onto Trafalmador by the Trafalmadorians. He's unstuck in time, and he for a while lives in a zoo. And he and this other human woman, Montana Wildhack, are the zoo exhibits for the Trafalmadorians. And this is actually probably where Billy is the happiest of in his life. He has a beautiful woman uh, who is his mate. They have a baby together, and he really does. Even though he's a zoo animal for the perverse sort of gratification of an unknown alien race, he's super happy with this setup. It's the life that he didn't know he wanted at the
And
expense of the life he has.
and he's being observed by Tralfamadorians, a bunch of creatures that look like bowling pins with hands for heads, with eyeballs in the middle of the hands. And when humans say something stupid, the Tralfamadorians, they close their hands.
It's all, and again, the main line that you should be getting from this, dear listener, is when life happens, so it goes. So it goes is the main line of the book. That, or I think this is repeated a few times. The Jan Janssen poem.
Jan Janssen from Wisconsin.
I work in a lumber yard there. I go here, I go there, and people say, I'm gonna fuck it up, but it's just this eternally repeating poem about a guy from Wisconsin named Jan Janssen, just as Billy's life is eternally recurring.
Yeah,
Interesting little piece by Vonnegut there.
yeah, the Tralfamadorians, the way that they could like, and this partially explains the structure of the book. The Tralfamadorians do not see time in a linear fashion the way humans do. When they look at time, it would be like we as humans looking at a mountain range. Like they look to the left, they see one point in time. They look to the right, they see another point in time. But they can access all points at time anytime they want. So the phrase "so it goes" appears in the book every time a character dies or a death is mentioned. And that's because in the Tralfamadorian concept of existence, death is not a terminal point, so it's not a big deal. To a Tralfamadorian, if you die, it's like, yeah, you cease existing in that moment, but there are plenty of moments previously where you have existed. And to a Tralfamadorian, you can go back into the past whenever you want. So therefore, there is no terminal point to a life because their nature of time is, if not strictly cyclical, it's adjustable. They can go back to the past, they can go back to the future. It's not linear at all. And that the Tralfamadorian conception of time really makes me think about the N word, Nietzsche, because Nietzsche talks about existence as an eternal cycle of recurrence, cycle of eternally recurring existence. And that's sort of like the Tralfamadorian way of looking at things, because there is no beginning, there is no end. Time is just this rich tapestry that you can access any point that you please whenever you wish. And Billy is unstuck in time, so he and the way the scenes are structured, they're non-linear. And the reason that 1 second he'll be in Dresden, 1 second he'll be getting drunk, sleeping with a woman at an optometrist conference. The next minute he'll be thrown into a pool by his dad as a child trying to teach him how to swim, is because that's the Tralfamadorian conception of time.
Did you ever see, there's that one movie, Arrival? that
Oh, the Jodie Foster alien. The aliens were parents or something.
Oh, no, not Arrival then. The Amy Adams one where she gets unstuck in time.
Oh, where she's the linguist and she has to learn the little tentacle squigglies to figure out what the aliens are saying.
Yep, yep. Otherwise, the Chinese are gonna nuke everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
is that Arrival?
No, Arrival's Jodie Foster.
Oh, what the
Like
hell am I?
that's the
What?
one where the big reveal is, oh, the aliens are your grandparents. Haha. Fuck
Oh,
you, viewer.
I don't know. Anyway, the Amy Adams one I thought was okay, but definitely because they also made a Slaughterhouse 5 film that
Oh,
wasn't
I've
very
seen
good.
parts of it. Yeah. What was it like in the 70s?
Yeah, it was like it was right after the book was super popular. Like they did
Oh,
a treatment of it pretty recently after.
oh,
Uh,
it's like a Catch 22. There was an old Catch
yeah,
22
yeah.
movie, and
Wasn't
some
very good
scenes are
either.
just. But yeah, I like to think it's the same about both of them. There are like some scenes that are really, really rad, but taking as a whole movie, not so good. I guess that's another thing we have to talk about. Like when you talk about people that fought a great war, wrote a great novel, Heller always comes up
Mhm.
with Catch 22. And I wonder, like, if what are the comparisons and contrasts between the two?
Right. That's a really good question actually because I've read them both. I liked both of them a lot, and they cover very similar themes. Uh, where Billy Pilgrim is fatalistic about his surviving the war, Yossarian is fatalistic about him ever getting out of the war. Right. He sees himself and his friends trapped in between the Germans who want to kill him and the officers who want him killed. Uh,
Yeah, I think
interesting.
I
Yeah,
think that the question of agency is very
mhm,
different in the two books. I think that the way Vonnegut looks at war in Slaughterhouse Five, it's like a force of nature. Like you can't there's no like explanation for it. It's just a nasty aspect of human nature. It's unavoidable. Any time that Billy Pilgrim talks to someone who mentions the bombing of Dresden, like Rosewater said, "Oh well, we had to do it." He's
no,
like,
no,
"I know."
that was Rumford.
Oh, yeah, Renfrew. Yeah, he said, it was necessary. He's like, "I know, I know." So that looks at it as it's like a force of nature. It's like, in the first chapter when he said he's writing an anti-war book, someone told him, "Well, you might as well write an anti-glacier book, right? Because they're both
Right.
forces of nature that humanity can't do anything about." I think Catch 22 is more about like the human agency behind all the bad things about war. I think in Catch 22, like the character of Milo Minderbinder is basically the embodiment of the military industrial complex. He keeps making a profit and he builds a huge corporation, and therefore, but he also wants a combat medal, but he's too busy running his corporation to do it. So the officers basically agree to force the other pilots to fly more missions so he can get his medal too.
Mm,
So like there's a villain behind the war. Like it's the colonels, it's the Milo. Like there's a finger you can point at. And I think the way that Vonnegut looks at war, it's like it's going to happen regardless of who's in command and who is the officer calling the shots. Like war will always happen.
right.
And
It's almost like so Heller is trying to get a bird's eye view of the war, where Vonnegut is getting like a spaceship's eye view of the war.
yeah, I think that would make sense. And I think Heller came out with his in '62,
Hmm.
so he was a little bit ahead of Vonnegut.
And they were
Um,
friends, the two of them.
yeah,
There's a really good story, sort of anecdote about the two of them. They're at a party at a billionaire's house, and I think it's either Vonnegut. Yeah, Vonnegut says to Heller, he says, You'd have to sell like 100,000 copies of Catch 22 or something like in order to afford a house like this. And Heller says, "Yeah, but we have Kurt." And he says, "No." He's like, "Enough." Just you,
I think that
people go to parties to meet interesting people, and it's seldom ever the rich guy hosting it.
I think the commonality between Catch 22 and Slaughterhouse 5 is both the humor.
Mm-hmm.
There's some sections in Catch 22 that I think are even funnier than the ones in Slaughterhouse 5, and I think Slaughterhouse 5 has hilarious parts in it.
There
And it's
is
really
a
interesting.
there is a
Oh, go ahead.
character named Major 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 Major, and it's played completely straight. And the only reason that it becomes a major is because his name is Major Major.
Yeah, and then and then they say, "Well, should we promote Major, 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 or no, no?" The colonels get mad and they want to demote him because once he becomes a major, he tells the sergeant, he's like, "Do not let anyone into my office unless I'm in the office. I mean, unless I'm not in the office. If I'm in the office, your orders are to make sure no one comes in my office." And the colonels find out that he's kind of shirking his duties, and then like they say, well, let's demote him, and then PFC Wintergreen says no, and PFC Wintergreen has way more power
Oh, he
than
has
just
the
about
most
any.
power of anybody in the book. He is.
And he, yeah, and he
I
says,
mean,
I'm not letting anyone get rid of the only major, 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 major in the army.
no, it's a terrific book. I will say that they both hit uh, the seriousness of the topic as well, and in probably the same way. You have the last chapter and a half of Catch 22 that really deals with the horrors of going up, and all of Yossarian's friends are dead. Uh, by the end, and we get a real clear picture of how Orr died. It's Orr that dies pretty horrifically up in the air, right?
No, no, Orr's the one that escapes. Orr is
Not
the one that's a pro at crashing his plane.
yes, that's right. It's then who is it?
The kid.
Yeah, and his horror.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway,
But
uh,
I think the commonality is the way they use humor, and you wonder about why they use it. And like in interviews, Vonnegut said, "Well, when you're in a completely hopeless situation where you really don't have control over your fate, like the last thing that you can do is make jokes about it. Like
mhm.
that's the last thing." And he said when he was in Dresden, he said, "Yeah, I made jokes for about 5 days, and then I was quiet." So that really makes like the seemingly simple depth of Kurt Vonnegut's writing, like even the humor, because it's just absolutely hilarious. And then when you step back and you realize, oh, the humor can be employed when you're in the worst possible situation. Like that's a way to keep your sanity. So that really makes the humor. I mean, it's still funny, but it's really harrowing when you consider that partly the reason for the jokes are because there was nothing else he could do. He had no control over his fate at that point.
And the jokes stop with Edgar Derby, who is a high school teacher, who is a friend of Billy's, and during the aftermath of the bombing, he is shot by the Germans for looting a teapot because he wanted to make a cup of tea for the boys.
Yeah, and this was I think it's probably helpful to talk about, like, after Vonnegut was captured and he was taken to Dresden. Well, first he was put aboard a train, and that train was actually strafed by Allied forces. But when he got there, and after the bombing of Dresden, it was his job, because which we really don't know how many people perished in Dresden. Like they keep revising the figures in like the most insane way. So Vonnegut said, like 140 to 160,000. And as more time goes on, like the quote unquote official sources keep reducing that number.
I think it's at what, 25K right now? I think you
Yeah, to
mentioned before.
25,000. Yeah, it was 50,000 last year, and now the Dresden Commission said it was 25,000. So I don't know. I would trust the opinion about numbers of a man who went to school to be an engineer, who actually went to Dresden, whose job it was after the bombing of Dresden to dig out the bodies of the people killed there. I would trust his estimate a lot more than I trust the 2024 Dresden Historical Society's numbers, personally.
Right. And I mean, at the end of the day, like the fact that a non-war producing city, right? Because I think they did try and attack a couple factories, but or at least that was the cover. But I mean, they destroyed an entire city trying to get at some munitions factories.
And
What?
optics. It was the Royal Air Command is the one that organized the bombing of Dresden, and they did it at the request of the Soviets. So they called Dresden the Florence of the Elbe, because it was this beautiful cosmopolitan city. It was known for, amazing industrial innovations, like the first modern brazier was made there. All of the lenses for glasses, telescopes, microscopes, they were all manufactured in Dresden. And they say that's partly the reason that the Soviets requested that they bomb it, because they were worried about optics on tanks, basically.
Hmm.
But the one thing that I am absolutely convinced about is that I would rather die in Hiroshima than in the bombing of Dresden.
Yes, yes, it's the same. It's the same. Was it Kyoto that was firebombed as well?
Well, it's okay. It's two different things. So yeah, Tokyo and Kyoto were both firebombed, and the commander of that was Curtis Millay. And so what he did
LeMay,
was,
LeMay.
yeah, yeah, Curtis LeMay flew over Tokyo and over these Japanese places, and he dropped incendiaries. He used no explosives whatsoever. He just dropped the incendiaries because of the traditional Japanese dwellings were essentially made of paper. So he didn't have to drop like conventional ordnance. So what happened in Dresden is different, and it's based on a phenomena that happened in the mid 1800s in Peshtigo, Wisconsin.
Mm.
So in Peshtigo, there was this weird environmental event. Peshtigo was a small town, and it was an agricultural community that was surrounded by wheat fields. And somehow, in I think 1854, there was a horrible fire, and the fire caught the crops on the ground on fire. And due to these weird wind conditions, it created a firestorm that burned 1.2 million acres with a wall of flame that was about a mile high. It was like an absolute freak environmental occurrence. Like, killed hundreds, if not thousands of people. Many people like actually took their own life because they were convinced that it was hell on earth.
Mm.
You're living in a small rural town and seeing a mile long wall of flame coming. Obviously, probably, yeah, you would, it was hell on earth if you didn't have any frame of reference.
Definitely.
So the Peshtigo incident, it became like a piece of trivia in history, except for a few meteorologists and general science nerd types. To them, it was called the Peshtigo paradigm. So in World War II, the British Air Command got obsessed with creating the perfect bombing. They had just survived the bombing of London, so they sat and they took notes at what the Germans did correctly and what the Germans failed at, and they tried to improve on it. And they also had documents about what happened at Peshtigo. So, and Vonnegut talks about this when he said that he wrote to the United States Air Force, and he tried to get like some facts and figures from the Air Force, and they wrote back and said that's classified information.
Right. Right.
So, and he thought it was silly because, the event had happened. There was no point in, concealing something that everyone knew about. But what he didn't know, it was based on this environmental event. So what the British Air Command did was they didn't do like LeMay in Japan and just drop incendiaries. They dropped a combination of tungsten-based incendiaries and conventional bombs. And by doing so, they created a anti-gravitational electrically charged firestorm.
Oh my
So,
God.
it wasn't merely a firebombing, and there were actually three different runs of it. The first run, I think, was like at 11 o'clock that night, and it was 500 British planes, and they dropped, half normal explosives, half incendiary, which basically set the entire city on fire. Like that pretty much destroyed the target. But then at like 4 o'clock in the morning, 700 more bombers flew over and dropped more incendiaries and more bombs. And then finally, early in the morning, the next day, thanks to bureaucracy, the Americans who were supposed to take part in the bombing, at the same time, but thanks to military bureaucracy, they were a few hours late. So they fly over the next day with 700 bombers of their own, and they drop incendiaries and explosives. So they create this crazy vortex with flame tornadoes. I mean, it's absolutely hellish listening to the descriptions of what happened to these people. Like you would have people, because it created a vacuum, people would just float in the air on the street and erupt into flames. People would be walking on the streets and they would stop moving because the soles of their shoes melted into the pavement, and then they'd fall on their face and erupt into flames. Like, what happened in Dresden was so much more terrible than what happened in Japan. And it's not really a question of numbers, even if we accept the crazy sum of 25,000 that they use now. It's just the absolute carnage and terror and abject horror of the bombing of Dresden that makes it so terrible.
There's a reason why Vonnegut needed 20 some odd years
Yeah.
to put this story on paper, and then also to do it in the way that he did do it. I could not imagine this. Yeah, I couldn't imagine what this did to him and his psyche. I don't want to psychologize because it's stupid, but what?
Yeah, but I think he was trying to disassociate from the event, because you
Yes.
notice with the concept of being unstuck in time, he really doesn't go into great detail about too much of the gory stuff that obviously Vonnegut himself saw.
It's almost like he gets to the Trafalmadorians take mercy on him and just blank out that part.
Right. Like the Tralfamadorian concept of time as like a coping mechanism for dealing with what he went through, which I mean is obviously a trauma to actually have lived through that, and doubly so because the attack that he experienced was an attack by his allies.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's even like a further layer of depth to it, because the Vonneguts were Germans.
Right. Yes.
Kurt's great grandfather moved to the United States in the 1800s, and he became a successful businessman. And his son was an architect, and then his grandson, who was Kurt Vonnegut's father, was an architect. And before World War II, they were like very proud Germans. They were not like what we would call assimilated Americans. Like, they proudly held on to their German heritage until World War I. And then obviously
they stopped speaking German, they Americanized. It's all very ironic.
Yeah, so Vonnegut is like, he's returning to the land of his forefathers. And, Dresden, he said, was the first real city that he ever saw in his life. In the book, he compares it to Oz. Like he had never seen an actual city before he saw Dresden. So he returns to this city in the country of his forefathers, but he does it in a time of war. And, he witnesses, horrible bombing. So I think there's a lot of like you have to work hard to escape madness being in a situation like that, I think.
There's one more character death. Well, there's two more, right? That are both played for laughs, right? And he does this pretty early on. He does this so that the death of Edgar Derby and the firebombing itself have more of an impact later on. One being the death of Colonel Wild. I think it's Wild Bob.
Yeah, Wild Bob, an older colonel.
Yep, who was obsessed with he not obsessed, but he was like this affable older gentleman who just loved his men and loved talking about his men, and he thinks that Billy is one of the guys from his unit. He talks about wanting to have this big barbecue, a big reunion for the entire unit, even though probably most of them have died. And he says, if you're ever in Cody, Wyoming, ask for Wild Bob.
Wild, Wild, and didn't no one call him Wild Bob?
Yeah,
He
no,
just
no,
wanted.
he insisted everybody call him Wild Bob,
Okay, yeah.
though no one did. It's like he gave himself a nickname, uh, which and he just passes away on the train car right before Roland does. And then there's also Valencia's death. This woman was
Oh,
so dedicated to Billy that when Billy gets into a plane crash, he is the only survivor, and she gets into a car accident driving to the hospital. And she doesn't realize this, but the muffler has become unstuck, and she's so distraught. She just wants to get to him. She drives all the way to the hospital, breathing in carbon monoxide. That by the time that she parks the car, she dies. It's like
yeah. It's
it's a
I
Kurt did not like this woman, and
Yeah,
I
it's like
don't.
a reverse Alanis Morissette.
Yeah.
The plane crashed down, but and you get the sense that like early on you think that she somehow died in the crash because she died the day of the plane crash. So, but
Mhm.
then you find out no, she actually wasn't in the crash at all. It was a even more freak accident, compounding the bad luck.
Right, and is meanwhile, Kurt has this other family on an alien planet, and that he seems even more sort of because he's got his daughter who now tries to take care of him, and she's all she's way too much and thinks that he's going crazy. His son joins the Green Berets because he hates communism. Uh, it it's all very strange that uh, I think that's the best way to describe it. Slaughterhouse Five is a very strange book.
But it's a beautiful, strange
Oh,
book. Like
terribly beautiful. I love this. It's yeah, it's one of the first books that I really fell in love with.
we can't put into words how well written it is or how funny it is,
Hmm.
but it's both. I actually I like it better than Catch 22 because I think it's written a little bit more tightly. I think towards the end of Catch 22, particularly the scenes in Italy, I think it kind of we go off the rails a little bit and it feels
Yeah.
a little bloated. Like this is like 275 pages, but it's deep. Like it's not like a breezy read. It's deep, but it's not so deep it's unenjoyable.
Is there anything else in the book that you think that we should cover? There's a lot.
Um,
There's a lot more to it. Definitely. We kind of gloss over uh, Billy's attempts to talk about Trafalgar. He gets on the radio in New York, and people think that he's putting them on.
yeah, he suddenly he decides after he's contacted by the Tralmadorians, he attempts to spread the word like, hey, everything's okay. Death is not that big of a deal. We go back and forth through time. I know this because I was abducted by aliens called Tralmadorians. And yeah, but he goes to where is it that he goes to a bookstore
Yeah,
And
in Times Square, back when Times Square wasn't Disneyland, it was like it was. I mean, there were prostitutes everywhere. It was everybody was doing drugs at the time. Times Square was very different in the 60s and 70s.
yeah, it was like Taxi Driver Times Square.
Yep, yep,
And he goes and he sees what he sees a Kilgore Trout book.
right,
Um, Synchronicity is really a thing in this book. And then he but most of the stuff they sell is like blue stuff. It's smut. Like they sell
right.
dirty
Oh
pictures
yes,
and
yes. The woman who he is captured with on Trafalgar is herself a pornographic actress.
yeah, that's how she got her start. And then there's another, and this Slaughterhouse Five was banned a few places because
Yep,
of these adult references. But then also there is a picture, and it's during the advent of photography, it is a woman attempting to mate with a pony, and Roland Weary has this picture in his pocket during the war, and he shows it to Billy briefly. And Billy, when he's older and he's at the Times Square bookstore, he sees the picture in the bookstore, which apparently that picture actually existed. It was
oh,
one of
I'm
the
sure. I mean, it was probably taken. It was probably the first donkey show in Tijuana.
yeah, it was like one of the first first instances of pornography, in photography. So like there's synchronicity like that, like the with oh, and then just when Roland and the two scouts in Roland's head canon, they are the three musketeers, and then Valencia Pilgrim is eating three
Yep,
musketeers
yep.
bars. You
Yeah,
know,
there's so much. Yeah, he really. You can tell how much fun he's having with this.
yeah,
Uh,
there's wonderful craftsmanship. How do you
yes.
think about the way that he writes women, which he's gotten flack for, and he's admitted in the past, like
Well, of
you
course,
don't
he's
really,
gonna admit it. He was a total shit lib. You know,
yeah,
he has no answer for that. I think that the women he writes are fine. I think that Valencia is a victim of her circumstances. Uh, Montana, she's a little too idyllic, but that's the point. This is supposed to be his ideal sort of Valhalla ending. You know, he gets to live a perfect life as a zoo animal.
yeah. I think it's like a very Tralfamadorian view on Vonnegut's politics. I think it's a sliding scale with time. I think
Yeah.
that he would be very okay with like the friendly, feel good Bernie Sanders type socialism,
Mhm.
but also like his just statements that he's made about women, like he would be canceled and branded to the right of Hitler today. He's given interviews before about the women's liberation movement, and he's like, they're like, well, Kurt, why are these women, saying that they're not going to have children anymore? And Kurt says, well, I don't really think that that's like a conscious choice on their part. I think it's more of a statement about the species that things have gone so wrong that they don't need to produce anymore. Although the women have no idea that's the idea, that's the reason why they're saying it. So like he would definitely be canceled, but it's worth noting that he was a huge influence on Jon Stewart. Um, and then I think it's worth talking about like Vonnegut's popularity. He had sort of a resurgence in the 80s and the 90s through television and movies.
Mhm.
He was
My first encounter with Kurt Vonnegut was because I saw Back to School when I was a kid. My dad
yes.
was a huge Rodney Dangerfield fan, and there's a scene where Kurt Vonnegut plays himself, apparently. So Rodney Dangerfield plays this guy, Thornton Mellon. He's a business guy, but he never got his college education, so he decides that he's gonna go back to school, right? And the lady, literature professor who he's trying to get with as well, assigns a paper on Kurt Vonnegut that he doesn't do. Instead, he hires Kurt Vonnegut to write the paper for him. So you've got the son goes to the door to see somebody's knocking at the door, sees who it is. Kurt Vonnegut introduces himself, as himself, and then later, who he gets the paperback. Rodney Dangerfield gets the paperback, and of course, gets an F because one, she knows that he didn't write it, and two, whoever did write it doesn't know the first thing about Kurt Vonnegut.
Yeah, and he's dating the professor, and she's like, "Yeah, but he doesn't know the first thing about Kurt Vonnegut." And so Thornton Mellon's mad, and he's trying to cancel the check
he
that he
cancels the check, and then Vonnegut tells him to go fuck himself. It's, yes.
And then in the 90s, like he started getting referenced in like shows like The Wonder Years in the late 80s, and then The Simpsons. And so I think it's because like his popularity, which is something that didn't happen with Heller, was that a lot of people that were writing in show business started calling him back and giving references to him, which I think made him more popular.
Well, okay, so there's that aspect, but then also in the early 2000s, after 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq, he writes Man Without a Country, right? He's very old at this point. He's basically stopped writing novels. He writes a few essays about basically the standard lib talking points about how Bush is the Antichrist and how he doesn't feel like an American anymore. And it's all very on brand for him. It's not that he's changed. It's that he suddenly becomes the wise old smart guy that people like Jon Stewart can reference. He becomes very useful to the propaganda machine.
Yeah, he was very much a creature of his times, always.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to realize that when he wrote this, he wrote it in the 60s. So he was calling back to one fundamental inflection point in American history, and he was doing it during another inflection point. I think when he was finishing up the last chapter was when Robert F.K. was assassinated, because he mentions it there. So it's really interesting how he takes one point where we read about it in the history books, and he writes about it in another inflection point. And I mean, of course, like George W. Bush was just tailor made for the enlightened liberal to see that, say he's anti-intellectual, he's just a dummy. And, that was very much Green Day before Green Day, Kurt Vonnegut, because that was just the thing to do. But I think it was ironic because by 2000, like the spirit of the 60s was, very counterculture, anti-establishment. And then by the time we get to 2000, like all these dudes are the establishment. Like they're not protesting on the streets. They're giving interviews on nationally televised shows about their opposition. But I think that, it's his politics. I mean, I don't agree with him, but I generally don't care about someone's politics as long as they have like quality work product. And I mean, Slaughterhouse V is a masterwork, regardless of any of his silly views. And like you said, the anti-war part of it is 110% understandable. He was a little bit of a collectivist socialist type. He kind of believed it, very anti-corporate. He thought that because and also I can justify that because he saw the publishing industry die, right? So he could write in Saturday Evening Post, Collier's. Other science fiction writers had like Weird Tales and like all the different pulp magazines. Like, you're running the only dedicated fiction magazine around right now. Like that whole industry like just died as soon as television became the dominant form of narrative entertainment. And now like cinema is dying because streaming is becoming the dominant form of narrative entertainment. So I can understand why he has such an anti-corporatist stance, because after the war he worked for General Electric. Well, no, immediately after the war he was a beat reporter on the crime beat in Chicago. And he would go and
he learned a little bit there, definitely.
Yeah. and he would see something, and then he would get on the payphone or whatever, and then crank the handle and ring it into someone who would write down what he dictated, and that wasn't enough money for his family. So after that, he got a job with General Electric, and when he was at General Electric, he basically compiled promotional material for the company. And while he was working at GE, during the weekends, he would work on short stories. And this is I think another reason that his quality is much different than your average pulp writer is because he created kind of a feedback loop, because he sent his stuff off to these more literary magazines, and they would either accept it or reject it. And if they rejected his story, they would give him a letter explaining why it didn't work. So he was able to utilize this feedback loop and, improve upon his writing. Where in the pulp stuff, like, I mean, no one ever wrote L. Ron Hubbard a letter and told him what he needed to improve, right?
Right.
Like it was like, we'll pay you 1 cent a word, and he's
And
like, okay,
actually,
well,
once he gets accepted, I think once his first story gets accepted into Collier's, he quits his job at General Electric and becomes a full-time writer. And the editor who told him, or who he was corresponding with, was like, "Wait, no, don't do that." And luckily it did end up working out for him. But he was so happy with the initial success of getting published that he threw everything else out and was going to do it full time.
and yeah, but it was actually possible. It's actually possible. Like
Mm-hmm.
today, if you're like, I'm going to quit my job to be a writer, it's like, nah,
Yeah, good
man.
luck, buddy.
Like if you're the best, most successful, most prolific writer today, the highest you can aim for is impoverished. Like it's just this industry and this thing, it just doesn't exist anymore. So I think that, people who write, like we're just trying to hold fast to language and writing, but there used to be an actual industry around it, and it used to be a way that not only could a person make a living, they could make a living and support a family from writing, which just doesn't exist anymore. And I think that Vonnegut, and he saw that industry crumble, and I think that's also part of the reason he's got an anti-corporatist stance.
I kind of want to end it there, Ham. Where can people help find you? Where can they support your work? Where can they lend you a hand?
Let's see. I write for the Nashville Pamphleteer. I've also got a piece in Double Dealer, as well as Isaac Simpson's Carousel, and I wrote for Men's World. So just wherever fine words are sold
I will make sure to link all those
for free.
down below.
Um,
And
but I just
go
want
ahead.
to think that like the essentially, and it's really, really hard. And I know we were all over the place and totally ADD. And it's not just because I'm totally ADD. It's because of the structure of this book. And if you haven't read it, you should, and you should form your own opinion on it. But from my perspective, like the book poses a general question to readers, and it's, how do we deal with the aspects of life that are tragic and inevitable, right? I mean, even today in the 21st century, like despite all of our advances with technology, we haven't eliminated war. Oh, we've gotten better at it. We've taken like weapons and we have improved them to the point where they're like exponentially more powerful than the stuff that was deployed in World War II. We've developed psychological warfare. We have silent weapons that we deploy against people now. And there's still conflict all over the world. Like you look at Palestine and Israel, Ukraine and Russia, it's almost like we're in a world war in everything but name. But, the question is like, how do we deal with the darker, tragic aspects of our nature? Because we know there have been world wars in the past, there have been horrors in the past, but we also know they're probably going to be in the future. And that's just an aspect of like the human condition. Like we can't outsmart ourselves into living in a just, verdant, and peaceful world. Like this horror is actually something that we as humans have always dealt with. And the question is like, what do we do to get through that, and what strategies do we use to overcome all these dark aspects of life, which I think is a theme that I get out of Slaughterhouse 5, as
I,
well as great entertainment.
I think that's very well said. Unfortunately, that is time, sir.
All
Uh,
right,
Thank you again for coming on, dear listener. Thank you for listening. I don't know how to end podcasts, so I will say insert ending here.
that's all, folks.